I'm very grateful to have been invited by the Brazilian Linguistics Association to make this presentation today in the series of talks by linguists. I have wonderful memories of having visited Brazil through the gracious invitation of Charlotte Galvez and Antonio Galvez, and I got a chance to see some of Sao Paulo and Campinas, and to meet some linguists and mathematicians who were there. I've been teaching the last few months, as many of you have been, and of course I've faced the very same challenges that you have. Some of us have spent more time learning about how to make videos than we ever thought we would need to, and I thought that, in fact, for today's presentation I would make a video. I thought it was a good idea. Well, it wasn't a bad idea, but when I sat down and created the video of the material I wanted to present, I discovered it took about an hour and a half. So I will upload that, and I hope if you're interested in what I have to say, you'll look at the longer video. But I'll present a part of it today, 45 minutes worth, roughly. The question that I'm interested in is the evolution of thought. How does it happen? You can approach the question from the point of view of the individual. You can approach the question from the point of view of a discipline. You can approach the question from a larger point of view, above the discipline as well. And it's mostly these the second and the third that I'm interested in. Not so much how my understanding or your understanding changes over time, but how does the thought and the understanding of a discipline, or even a broader group of people and researchers, how does that evolve over time? Since I'm a linguist, I'm going to be talking about linguistics, and I want to talk about a kind of a continuity that is not very much discussed, and which I think is extremely important. As somebody who, speaking for myself, as somebody who has spent considerable part of their career as a generative linguist, I'm interested in the origins of that. I'm not sure if I'm a generative grammarian anymore. I'm not, and there are all sorts of questions to ask about this, but I certainly have a certain kind of commitment. It's hard to say exactly what it is, but a certain kind of commitment to generative grammar. And I'm interested in looking at the historical basis for the origins of generative grammar. So what I mean by that is, I'd like to tell you a story, look at the history that goes from about 1890 up until about 1955. 1955 was when generative grammar was just getting off the ground. So that's what I want to look at with you, and the story I'm going to tell in this 45-minute version. It's a little bit shorter than the whole story. I'm going to sketch the whole story for you in a moment, and then tell you a little bit about which aspects I'm going to be able to cover in 45 minutes. But there are three themes which come back a number of times, and it would be good for you to focus on. So the first is the notion of the mechanization of thought. Meaning, if we want to understand how thought works, to what extent do we want to, we could say, reduce thought, although why I'd use the word reduce as opposed to transform or translate is worth our attention. How do we reduce thought to a purely mechanical operation? That's a deep question, and one that comes up over and over again. Generative grammar is engaged with this question. Generative grammar, from its beginnings, has been committed to the idea that when a linguist, I was going to say grammarian, when a linguist creates a theory of a particular language, or a theory of language in general, that which it explains contains nothing that isn't purely formalizable. There's no subjectivity in the application of a particular linguistic model in generative grammar. Okay, so that's the first, this focus on the significance of the mechanization of thought. The second is thinking about the question of the architecture of a particular discipline. And although we don't do that all that much anymore, yes, there are a lot of people who say, yes, I'm interested in the interface between, let's say, syntax and phonology. But this idea that we need to maintain a clear and coherent overall architecture of the entire science, that's a notion, it's not its moment anymore. But for the first 50 years of the 20th century, it was very important for reasons that I'd like to discuss a little bit with you. And then the third thing I would like to talk a little bit about is the roots of the notion of transformation in the Vienna Circle group of philosophers and some of the people whose thoughts evolved out of the work of the Vienna Circle. So those are the three topics that are going to suffuse the general discussion I have today. Let's turn now to a map that I've created for you and for this talk. The story that I want to tell is complicated enough that I thought I would draw a picture for you. We've got a lot of people here coming at different points of time and doing different kinds of things. So we're going to start with David Hilbert, who was an important German mathematician at the end of the 19th century and the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He had a lot of impact on the Vienna Circle, which was a group of philosophers and scientists interested in philosophy who gathered in Vienna basically from the end of World War I up until the middle of the 1930s. Rudolf Carnap was the person who is today best known, who was part of that group. He was one of the organizers. The group was greatly influenced by a number of people whose names and perhaps whose work you know, including Bertrand Russell. Ludwig Wittgenstein had a large impact on the Vienna Circle. Hans Reichenbach, who was a philosopher in Berlin, was very close in his philosophy to the Vienna Circle. And there are other people who play an even more important role in our story who were themselves directly influenced by the Vienna Circle. Willard Van Ornum Quine, W.V.O. Quine, Van Quine, was perhaps the most important for our story. He got his PhD in philosophy at Harvard, went to Europe and on a postdoc where he met Rudolf Carnap, and Carnap had a great influence on his thought afterward. Nelson Goodman was also very close to Quine, also a grad student at Harvard, and eventually, his career included several years at the University of Pennsylvania, where Noam Chomsky was one of his students, and eventually he got back to Harvard, where he became a colleague of Quine's there. There are several people in the area of mathematical logic who play a role in this story. Most of them were influenced in one fashion or another by Hilbert. How could they not be? Everybody was influenced by Hilbert. But these include such people as Kurt Gödel of Gödel's theorem. John von Neumann's important, although his name I don't think is going to come back as such. He was an assistant to David Hilbert. Alonzo Church and Alan Turing play a role in the development of the concept of computation. Emil Post is somebody who is also a mathematical logician whose name you might not know, but his idea of what we've come to know as the Turing machine has left an impact on our conceptions. What we call the Turing machine today was kind of a joint creation of Post and Turing. And Post's work was developed by Paul Rosenblum in a small textbook that was published in 1950, which plays a role for us, both because he talks about the possibility of viewing the generation of sentences as something parallel to a mathematical proof. And Noam Chomsky was part of a seminar taught by Henry Hege at the University of Pennsylvania just before Chomsky went off to be a Harvard Junior Fellow in 1951 at Harvard, at which point he would begin writing logical structure of linguistic theory. Zelig Harris is an important person, of course, as well. Harris spent his career at the University of Pennsylvania. He was Chomsky's teacher, got Chomsky interested in linguistics, and he himself was very influenced, as he will tell us, by the work of the people who I've mentioned so far, basically the Vienna Circle, people influenced by Hilbert and so forth. So, and Yehoshua Bar Hillel plays an important role as well. But a friend and colleague with Noam Chomsky, but also somebody very close to Rudolf Carnap. So that's kind of an overall picture, and I'll probably come back to this scheme later on to help you understand where we are as we walk around this. I'd like to talk to you today about the origins of generative grammar. And there's no better way to do that than to begin with a book that Noam Chomsky wrote in 1955 called The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. The book was published in 1975. I was a graduate student at MIT at the time, and I bought it right away. I read it. It had an enormous impact on me. And I think that anybody who reads it, who has a solid foundation in the work that Zelig-Harris was doing in linguistics in the 1940s, especially as it was laid out in his 1951 book, Methods in Structural Linguistics. If you've got a solid foundation in Harris's work, if you've got a solid foundation in the history of mathematical logic stretching from the beginning of the 20th century up until 1950, if you've got a solid foundation in 20th century philosophy, especially involving Russell, the Vienna Circle, by which I mean, of course, Carnap and his Carnap's philosophical cousin in Berlin, Hans Reichenbach, and people who were enormously influenced by the Vienna Circle, such as Quine and Goodman. If you've got a solid foundation in those three areas, then it's really easy to understand where Chomsky is coming from in this book. However, most linguists don't have a solid foundation in this area, and that's the purpose, that's the point of my discussion today. To some degree, the material that I'm going to discuss is covered in a book that I published last year with a colleague from the University of Paris, Bernard Laks, and this book was published at the University of Chicago Press and called Battle of the Minefields. Some of the material is covered in a book that we are now in the process of writing a follow-up to Battle in the Minefields. I should mention, too, that there's a very good book written by Marcus Tomelin, published in 2006, called Linguistics and the Formal Science, which discusses quite a number of the topics that I'm going to talk about today, and I highly recommend it. One of the points that it's important to bear in mind, and which Laks and I discussed at great length in Battle in the Minefields, is how easy it is for ideas, questions, and answers to shift from one discipline to another. We often think of them as moles, which, animals that burrow underneath, that go from one garden to another, and this, in our case, basically from one discipline to another. Moles that burrow underground, go underneath a fence that separates one discipline from another, and show up in another discipline. And oftentimes people in the new discipline in which the mole presents him or herself, the people in the new discipline have no idea that they're actually looking at an animal that was in their neighbor's garden just a few minutes before. So in the case of linguistics, we need to think about what the neighboring fields are, the fields with which linguistics has interacted a great deal over the decades and now centuries that linguistics has existed. And the biggest and most important candidates for being a neighbor are philosophy and logic and psychology and sociology and anthropology, just to mention the most obvious cases. Let's begin our story with David Hilbert, a very influential German mathematician at the end of the 19th century, and begin with the question of geometry. David Hilbert decided to redo the foundations of geometry at the end of the 19th century for a simple and very straightforward reason. Geometry had been a major challenge for mathematics throughout the 19th century. At the beginning of the century, geometry seemed to be a field that was over 2,000 years old. It went back to Euclid in the classical times of Greece. At the beginning of the 19th century, mathematicians were concerned about the status of the so-called parallel postulate, which said that given a straight line and a point not on that line, that there is exactly one line that can be drawn through the point, which is parallel to the original line. Parallel meaning both can be extended infinitely and they will never intersect. So what's the status of this? Is it independent? Does it need to be a separate axiom? And in order to show that it didn't need to be stated as a separate axiom, a number of mathematicians tried to formulate different versions of it, its negation in one form or another, to see what would happen. So you could consider the possibility that given a straight line and a point not on the line, there are no lines that can be drawn through the external point that won't eventually intersect with the original line. Or alternatively, given a straight line, a point not on the line, there are two or more different lines which will never intersect the original straight line. Well, it turned out that any of those assumptions worked very well, and they created new versions of geometry, which eventually came to be called geometries of positive and negative curvature. So by the end of the 19th century, we had a flourishing field of geometry, but really the question was, How come 2,000 years plus of mathematics hadn't revealed to mathematicians before this century that there were these other fields of geometry? How did the lack of this assumption play out? How was it that 2/3 of the world of geometry had somehow been hidden from geometers? And Hilbert decided he was going to redo Euclid, but do it right. And that meant getting all the postulates or axioms right. And furthermore, it meant really understanding what the rules of inference were. This is a crucial step that we need to formalize as much as we possibly can, and in a certain sense to mechanize what the principles are of inference. And in the end, Hilbert proposed that proofs themselves be the subject of a mathematical analysis. So mathematics, we know that there are mathematics, there are branches of mathematics that deal with sets, with numbers, with geometrical forms. Hilbert said there should be a mathematics of proof as well. So Hilbert's ideas were extremely influential. He believed that it was important for each field to create a rich, highly articulated architecture of itself so that it could understand itself well, so that it would have no assumptions built in that it wasn't aware of. And furthermore, he thought that was important so that other fields could interact, or as we say today, interface with, let's say, some field of mathematics, let's say geometry, or for that matter, analysis. An external field, a different field, needs to be able to know whether it can firmly count on a neighboring field to give it results that are trustworthy. And so Hilbert focused on making explicit the rules of inference, of course, making explicit the axioms and postulates as well, and making sure that there is a potential in the architecture of scientific disciplines for all of the fields of science taken broadly, to form a unity. These ideas were picked up by the Vienna Circle, which we will get to in a moment, 15, 20 years later. And Hilbert's ideas were important throughout the 20th century. So there's the focus on the mechanization of thought, which is to say, to find ways to specify what the legitimate rules are of inference that do not involve in any fashion the subjectivity of the mathematician. Now, not all mathematicians agreed with Hilbert on this. And Brewer, the very influential Dutch mathematician for whom Hilbert had a great respect, couldn't have agreed less with Hilbert about this. But Hilbert's view was absolutely the one that has been the most influential in the 20th century. I think it's important to bear in mind that if we go down this road, which is essentially a definition of what counts as a science, then it has some real consequences for us. So the first is that certain kinds of approaches to understanding language don't match, they don't fit. I'm thinking, first of all, of a very interesting work in syntax that Nicolas Ruet, the French syntactician, was doing in the 1980s and into the 1990s, which I, for one, found very interesting. Or, for that matter, the work of Susumu Kuno in that time, or coming to today, the kind of work in sociolinguistics that Penny Eckert describes as third wave of sociolinguistics. We make a choice, in the sense, as to what we mean by science, and that has certain consequences. And I'll just say as a footnote, I recall reading last week a defense of generative grammar, you may have seen online as well, in which the highly contestable statement, in my view, statement was made that all it takes for something to be called generative grammar is the understanding that it's a science, as if the notion of science couldn't be contested, as if it were totally obvious what a science is. Well, it's scientists, it's all us people who figure out what science is. Anyway, that's the point. Foolhardy though it may be, I'm going to try to summarize some of the basic ideas of the Vienna Circle in about 3 minutes. So first of all, it's clear the most important principle of the Vienna Circle was that it's possible to take a scientific approach to the problems of philosophy. And second, taking a scientific approach means using logic, modern logic, of the sort developed, well, first by George Boole in the 19th century, and Frege, and Bertrand Russell, and to some extent Ludwig Wittgenstein. The use of logic was central to this problem. And a third point that is very important is that the meaning of statements, especially scientific statements, is closely connected to observation sentences. And these observation sentences were typically called protocol sentences. And it was the responsibility of the philosopher of science working with a scientist to make explicit what the connection was between statements in a science and observation sentences. Studying this would bring us to the conclusion that there were many perspectives, many disciplines, many ways of approaching questions that were in fact meaningless, and that would lead to their elimination. So there's a solid core of eliminativism in the Vienna Circle approach. That is to say, it's a good thing if we can come up with a method that tells us that a certain approach or a certain style of talking about problems should simply be eliminated from the universe of sensible philosophical discourse. And so in that process, these observation sentences, these protocol sentences, play a privileged role. At the same time, the responsibility of this philosopher of science, this philosopher who is restructuring or making explicit the structure of science, is to help each discipline, each scientific discipline, to create an architecture of the concepts in that science, which would then lead us essentially to a ladder, perhaps a lattice, of concepts within a science in which there was an explicit understanding of how higher level concepts were defined in terms of lower level concepts. And finally, language plays an important role for the Vienna Circle. And in part, it's because natural language can lead us astray, a sentiment that Bertrand Russell had been championing for quite some time, well before the Vienna Circle. Language can lead us astray. We need to construct a better language, which won't be a natural language anymore, but it'll be a language that philosophers of science can use, which will not have these irregularities and other characteristics that can lead us astray. So, for example, the notion of bound variables and quantifiers is something that will play an important role in the constructed language that the Vienna Circle scientists will use, but isn't present in natural language. And yet, what we'll see is the methods that philosophers inspired by the work of the Vienna Circle, the work that they did on the work they did on language, would then be turned around by people, some philosophers, some non-philosophers like Harrison and Chomsky. Those methods would then be turned around and used to study natural language. And so the centrality, for example, of syntax and semantics was something that emerged out of this Vienna Circle discussion of the nature of language. And we'll be following that in the minutes to come. I'm not going to say any more about the general approach of the Vienna Circle, but I would like to say a little bit more about their approach to language, and in particular to natural language. So, in a sense, the party platform was that the Vienna Circle wasn't going to say anything about natural language, and they certainly didn't feel themselves responsible for doing that. But the fact of the matter was they perceived that the kind of changes that they were suggesting for the new language they wanted to use could be used to better understand natural language. And I'd like to read to you two famous passages, one from Hans Reichenbach, which is actually, I'm going to read it first, but it actually comes from later than the second. The second is by Rudolf Carnap in a very famous and influential article that he published in the 30s in English. So let's look at these, and both of these can be summarized with the platform, I would say, or the plank in the platform, that syntax is too important to leave to the linguists. So let's take a look at what they wrote. I may add the remark that my personal fortunes were of great help in the writing of this book. The migration of intellectuals, which followed the disastrous political developments in Germany, has greatly contributed to an exchange of the various standards of civilization, and I, for one, cannot but be grateful to a fate which led me into various countries, not as a traveler, but as a teacher and collaborator in the education of youth. I've thus taught logic and scientific methods in various countries and various languages, and I've studied the reaction of students of many nationalities to an instruction in a scientific logic. At the same time, the necessity of teaching in several languages led me to try to adapt the methods of symbolic logic to the study of conversational language, and I thus undertook an inquiry which turned out to be useful for the understanding both of logic and of language. The present book is the first systematic presentation of such dual use of the logistic symbolism. I should be glad if the philologist could make use of these contributions by a logician who advances no claim to be an expert in philology, but who feels that the state of traditional grammar is hopelessly muddled by its two-millennial ties to a logic that cannot account even for the simplest linguistic forms. Our present grammar, as it is taught, with its artificial classifications and gratuitous constructions, is based on obvious misunderstandings of the structure of language. We should like to hope that the results of symbolic logic will, someday, in the form of a modernized grammar, find their way into elementary schools. It seems to us that the deficiencies of traditional grammar are equally visible in the science of language in its present condition. The high level of historical and psychological analysis in philology is not matched by a similar level in the understanding of the logical side of language. If philologists would try to make use of a modernized grammar for linguistic purposes, they might discover new means of elucidating the nature of language. In the hope that our appeal will be heard outside the camp of the logicians, and will be taken up by the few linguists who are aware that a science of language cannot be constructed without a scientific logic, we present in the following sections the present status of logistic analysis of conversational language and indicate the outlines of a logistic grammar. Let's begin with a very famous and influential article by Rudolf Carnap, which was published in Volume 1, Number 1, page 5, of the new journal, Philosophy of Science. And he laid out his basic understanding of the philosophy of science from the point of view of the Vienna Circle. An early section is entitled Logical Syntax of Language, and he writes, "By the logical syntax, or also briefly syntax, of a language, we shall understand the system of the formal, that is, not referring to meaning, rules of that language, as well as to the consequences of these rules. Therein we deal first with the formative rules," in parentheses, the translator, who's the editor, has written Formregeln, which decree how from the symbols, for example, words of the language, propositions can be built up. Secondly, with the transformation rules, or Umformungsregeln, which decree how from given propositions new ones can be derived. If the rules are set up strictly formally, they furnish mechanical operations with the symbols of the language. The formation and transformation of propositions resembles chess. This reminds us of Saussure's use of chess as a metaphor. Like chess figures, words are here combined and manipulated according to definite rules. But thereby we do not say that language is nothing but a game of figures. It is not denied that the words and propositions have a meaning. One merely averts methodically from meaning. One may express it also thus: language is treated as a calculus. That the formal, calculus-like representation of the formative rules is possible is evident. What linguists call rules of syntax are indeed such formal, or at least formally expressible, rules for the formation of propositions. We can see, however, clearly that the transformation rules, which one usually calls logical rules of deduction, have the same formal, that is, syntactical character. And that is the reason why we call the combined rules of syntax, the combined system of rules, syntax, in widening the terminology of linguists. Since Aristotle, the efforts of logicians, more or less consciously, were directed towards formulating the deductive rules as formally as possible, that is to say, possibly so that with their help the conclusions could be calculated mechanically from the premises. This was attained first in a strict manner only in modern symbolic logic. The traditional logic was too much hindered by the defect of the language of words. For a certain part of the language of science, we already know a strictly formal theory, namely Hilbert's mathematics. It considers the symbols and formulas of mathematics without reference to meaning. in order to investigate the relations of deducibility, sufficiency, consistency, etc. This mathematics is, hence, in our manner of expression, the logical syntax of mathematical language. The logical syntax of the language of science meant here is an analogous extension with reference to the language of all of science. Later he added, the decisive point, however, is this. Is it also possible to formulate the concept entailment purely formally? If the transformation rules of language are set up purely formally, we call a proposition an inference or entailment of other propositions if it can be constructed from those propositions by the application of transformation rules. The question whether a certain proposition is an inference, an entailment of certain other propositions or not, is therefore completely analogous to the question whether a certain position in chess can be played from another or not. This question is answered by chess theory, that is a combinatorial or mathematical investigation, which is based on the chess rules. That question is thus a formal one. It is answered by a combinatorial calculus or mathematics of language, which rests on the transformation rules of language. That is what we've called the syntax of language. Briefly, entailment is defined as deducibility according to transformation rules. Since these rules are formal, entailment is also a formal syntactical concept. You know, it amazes me now that none of the generative semanticists, Jim Macaulay, George Lakoff, went back and read Carnap. Boy, they would have had fun with these observations. Let's turn now from the philosophy side of things to the linguistic side of things. So we're talking basically the 1940s at this point, and the person among American linguists who I think was the most creative and thoughtful linguist on the scene was Zelig Harris. So we're going to first look at what Zelig Harris had to say about this general philosophical context and its impact on what he was trying to do, and then we'll turn to the work of one of his students, who was Noam Chomsky, who had his own views. And Chomsky, in addition, had been a student of Goodman, Nelson Goodman, at Penn. So let's take a look first at what Harris had to say, and then some of the early things that Chomsky had to say along these lines. The background for the work came largely from the foundations of mathematics and logic and the analysis of formalisms. This was relevant to language because in all of these systems there were sentences, propositions, formulas with partially similar structure, syntax. More specifically, there was the then current constructivism in the criticisms by the intuitionists in mathematics, such as Brewer, in Russell's theory of types, in the work of Emil Post, and in the Turing machine procedure. Later, I considered that I had philosophical support in the constructivist, nominalist approach of Nelson Goodman's The Structure of Appearance. Going back to the early background, there was also the development of recursive methods by Gödel, Tarski, and others. And in logic, there was Łukasiewicz's sentential calculus, Lesniewski's categorial grammar, and the syntax of logic in Willard Van Orman Quine's Mathematical Logic of 1940. I had conversations about transformations with many people, with Piaget and the psychologist David Rappaport, with Carnap and his follower Bar Hillel, with Max Zorn of the Lemma, to whom I showed the whole system at the Indiana University Linguistics Institute, and with others. I had many very helpful discussions with Henry Honingsveld, with M.P. Schutzenberger, and with Maurice Gauss, and enlightening comments from André Lontin. My closest work was with Henry Hige, who did a great amount of work on the methods. I also had a great many conversations with my students, above all with Noam Chomsky, who moved on in the direction of a comprehensive generative transformational grammar in his syntactic structures and many major later books. Let's go back a slide to what Harris was saying, and let's take a look at this sentence here that I've underscored. I considered that I had philosophical support in the constructivist, nominalist approach of Nelson Goodman's The Structure of Appearance. We really need to take a look at that. Goodman was Harris's colleague at Penn, was Chomsky's teacher at Penn as well. And in order to do that, we have to take a look at Goodman's The Structure of Appearance. But we can't go to that directly. The Structure of Appearance was a response to Carnap's logical structure of the world, the Aufbau. So we'll have to take a look at that first. Let me try to describe to you in 2 or 3 minutes this notion of a constructional system that Carnap works out in the Aufbau, and that Goodman develops in his own way 15 years later. In the Aufbau, the text begins with an epigraph from Bertrand Russell, which is this: "The supreme maxim in scientific philosophizing is this: wherever possible, logical constructions are to be substituted for inferred entities." This kind of gets to the heart of what these constructional systems are built for. So throughout these discussions, think of us as trying to build a ladder so that every technical term that we've got in our science, let's say it's linguistics, every theoretical term we've got either lives on a particular level or relates to, or conceivably more than two levels. And so each of these terms will be introduced in an explicit way, and a term like phoneme will be related to a phonetic description. A term like morphophoneme will be related to a notion like phoneme. A notion like morpheme may be related to morphophoneme or phoneme. And in introducing such terms as phoneme and morphophoneme at each level, the job of the person constructing such a system is, on the one hand, to be a scientist and therefore to show how what we've learned about morphophonemes or phonemes, or you name it, what we've learned about those in our scientific progress over the last X decades, how what we've learned indeed can be packaged in the way that we're talking, and then in addition to give a very explicit grammar of how each individual concept relates to other concepts. Okay, so there's the job is twofold. On the one hand, we're building a system that has an explicit syntactic structure, you might say. It has an explicit structure. So on the one hand, the relationships between the terms have to be made totally explicit. On the other, there's an understanding that terms are introduced, and when they're introduced, they are meant to connect up with what the scientist has learned about his or her discipline, in this case, linguistics. Okay? So it's not, the systems that we're building up are not unanalyzed symbol systems, far from it. And they're not even mathematics. But they're not scientific theories in the way that's generally explained to us in high school, for example. So imagine the notion of an electron. You know, the way we think about an electron is somebody comes up with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis includes the word electron, and you make some predictions of the hypothesis and you test them, and then you say, yes, now we have strong reason to believe that the electron exists. Well, that's fine, but that's not what this kind of theory construction is about. Terms become introduced into the system in a logical way. So experiments, of course, play a role in the advancement of science. But with each generation of scientists, the job remains to be done of building a constructive system that contains the knowledge that we as scientists have of a scientific field. And that's what Carnap wanted to do. So this was the sort of thing a philosopher could do, working hand in hand with a scientist, to construct an overall logical scaffold of a field. And that essentially is what Harris does throughout his book Methods in Structural Linguistics. And it's what Chomsky does in LSLT. It's not all that he does, obviously, but it's a good part of it. Both Harris and Chomsky talk about levels. For Chomsky, it's much more focused on the notion of level, and he gives an abstract characterization of what a level is. But they share a goal of this sort. And it's quite striking. Neither of them, neither Harris nor Chomsky, ever do that again later in their careers. And I would be hard-pressed to think of any linguist who's done that in the years since. So for that matter, you know, you can look back to people like Bloomfield and others trying to do this in the 30s in the pages of language, but their attempts to be Carnapian were much, much more simplistic than what Harris and then later Chomsky end up doing. Zelig Harris ends his 1951 book, Methods in Structural Linguistics, with a summary of what he's achieved at the end of the book. And what he's done is he's reduced all of linguistic analysis to essentially 9 chapters, 9 problems, and the solution to each of these is spelled out with a list. So we end up with a list of lists. There are 9 lists. And these will correspond very clearly to what Chomsky clearly calls levels in LSLT. So let's just see what they are in Harris. So the first is the segment phoneme list. The second is the phoneme distribution list. The third is the automatic morphophonemic list. The fourth is the non-automatic morphophonemic list. The fifth is the alternative morphophonemic symbol list. The sixth is the classified morpheme list. The seventh is the morpheme sequence list. The eighth is the component and construction list. And the ninth is the system list, sentence list, which is essentially the syntax of the language. And this is it. This is what a grammar of a language will look like on the model that Harris presents in this book. We'll turn to Chomsky, and we'll see that he clarifies this notion, characterizing each as a level, and then he gives a more abstract characterization of a level in such a way that each of the particular levels can be viewed as an instantiation of this larger schema that Chomsky defines. I'm going to read a little bit from LSLT, Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, for you. It's hundreds of pages. You obviously can't look at every detail. But the overall point of the book is to provide a theory of linguistic levels. And let me just share some points with you that are relevant to the things I've been discussing up to now. So early on he writes that linguistic theory presents an abstract construction of a system of levels of representation related to each other in certain fixed ways and formulated in terms that are operationally interpretable in a certain specified manner. Then the next chapter is basically, as you see here, chapter 2, linguistic levels. So we've been led to regard the theory of linguistic structure as being essentially the abstract study of levels of representation. And there's a footnote there which says that the particular form of these constructions was suggested in an unpublished paper by Henry Hege, and in the details of notation and axiomatization, we generally follow Paul Rosenblum, Elements of Mathematical Logic. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into a discussion of Rosenblum's Elements of Mathematical Logic, but there's just all sorts of really interesting things to consider and to discuss. And then there's a footnote coming just after that, which is, again, relevant to some of the earlier references that I've alluded to, or in some cases followed up on. Chomsky says, see Chomsky Systems of Syntactic Analysis for discussion of the possibilities of constructing linguistic theory with very meager formal apparatus using many devices developed by Goodman. See the structure of appearance in Goodman and Quine in their Steps Towards a Constructive Nominalism. Okay, well, number of references there that are relevant. I put together this document here which shows how some of these documents, articles, books are related to one another. Once again, I've made a picture to help you remember the connections here that are important among these various publications that I've cited. So on top, time is going up in this model here. At the top, we've got Chomsky's LSLT. At the bottom, the lowest entry is Rudolf Carnap's The Logical Structure of the World and Carnap's Logical Structure of Language from the 20s and 30s. Both are cited by Bar Hillel in his important On Syntactic Categories, published in 1950. There's Goodman and Quine, Step Towards a Constructive Nominalism, and Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics, and Nelson Goodman's Structure of Appearance, which will all be cited and influence Noam Chomsky's first published paper, his Systems of Syntactic Analysis. And then the LSLT itself cites both Chomsky's paper, as we've just seen, and the other work by Goodman and Quine on developing constructional systems. Time to draw this all to a conclusion. I trust that you understand that in our study of Chomsky's logical structure of linguistic theory, I haven't focused on this book because somehow I think it's closer to the truth than anything else. I'm using it as a way to dig into the origins of generative grammar so we can better understand the reasons why we or other people do what they do. Any kind of research that you or I or anybody else does is based on a set of questions. And we generally take questions for granted, but we shouldn't. And the best way to understand what the questions are that various people in the field focus on and study is to look at the origins, to find out where do these questions come from, and asking that question and finding the answers is the best way to liberate ourselves, in a sense, from the shackles, from the chains of simply being bound to those questions. When we understand where the questions came from, it's the first step towards saying that we agree or possibly we disagree. That's the sense in which I've been exploring LSLT and its connection to work at the Vienna Circle and other logicians before and after. I hope that you found this interesting. If you have, I think you'll find our book Battle in the Minefields interesting as well, and look forward to discussing these questions with you.